All right, so for question number 8, it's asking you to read the histogram that's given and answer some basic questions about that. All right, so the first thing that I'm going to say is when you're trying to read a graph, any of these graphs in MyLab, make sure you click on this little third button that looks like a square with a triangle to make the graph bigger and so that you can see the scale more accurately. Okay, make sure you pop the graph out. Once you do that, all right, the first question says, give the class with the greatest relative frequency. Okay, so relative frequencies are on the vertical axis. That means the greatest relative frequency is the highest bar. All right, now, if it asked you what that greatest relative frequency was, you'd look at the vertical axis and you'd say 0.25. Because it asked you about the class, you're going to have to look at the values on the horizontal axis because that's where the lengths are given in centimeters. Now, histograms use the midpoint to label each class. You'll notice that's the center of each bar. This question in part A wants you to specify where the class starts and where it begins. Okay, so what you're going to need to do is use the horizontal scale to figure out where that happens. Okay, so like I said, the greatest relative frequency occurs right here at the tallest bar. All right, the class that corresponds to that has a midpoint of 35.5. All right, if it asked you for the midpoint, that would be your answer. All right, now, this doesn't ask you for the midpoint. It asks you for the limits, all right? So what you need to do from there is you need to look at the horizontal axis and figure out where this is and where this is. All right, well, if you just look at the horizontal axis, you'll see that the midpoints are increasing by 1, right, with each time you move up. So that means each one of these little tick marks in between is going up by a half. So like this would be 31, this would be 32. This would be 33, this would be 34. So that means this class that we're looking at starts at 35 centimeters and ends at 36 centimeters. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do for part A. Whoops. I don't think it's going to let me check because I'm in your problem. All right, so part B says estimate the greatest and the least relative frequencies. So now B doesn't want to know about the classes on the horizontal axis. It wants to know about the actual relative frequencies. So again, make sure you've popped that graph out so you can see it. All right, and then look at the tallest bar to get the greatest relative frequency at 0.25. Look at the shortest bar right over here to get the lowest relative frequency. All right, these other tick marks that are not showing, right, just using the scale, would be 0.04, 0.03, 0.02, and 0.01 right here. So that would be your lowest relative frequency. All right, so if you want to know about the classes, those are on the horizontal axis. Use the scale accordingly. If you want to know about the relative frequencies, those are going to be on the vertical axis. All right, the last one, describe any patterns. If you read through the different choices that they give you, you will be able to rule out the ones that don't match your graph. All right, so for that part C, I would say use process of elimination. Read through the choices, any of them that don't look like what's happening in your graph. Like if it said most links are less than 31.5. you'd say, well, that's not right because there's very little frequency there. If you do that and rule out the ones that don't work, then you should be able to see which one is going to be a reasonable description for that data set. All right, now I know that you had some questions about 12 through 15, all right? So I'm not going to work through this whole problem for you because you really need to do that, all right? You really need to walk through the steps to make sure that you understand. But what I will say is if you will find question 12 in the practice, you can click on view an example or help me solve this, and it's going to walk you through step by step what those are. All right. Now they're going to follow the exact steps that were defined in my video where I took the speeds and created classes and frequency. But again, if you want to see that for this particular problem, then what you need to do is you need to go back to practice. So like if I go back to the course dashboard, let me try this one. There we go. So either on your dashboard or under assignments, right? If I go to 2.1 practice, this is the one that's not graded, right? That doesn't count towards your grade. And you want to spend some time in practice because that's where you can get help on these. So if I go to question number 12, because that's what I was working on, notice this is the same type of question. The data values might be a little bit different, but I've got these options down at the bottom. View an example will walk me through the steps for a similar problem. All right, so the numbers might change just a little bit, or help me solve this will prompt me. It'll say, do this first, right? Type these in, and it will check your steps as you go. And then when you go back to the problem, it's going to regenerate, but you'll know what those steps will look like, and you can apply them to that new generation of the question. So that's my biggest piece of advice to you. Anytime you're having problems with a particular question in the homework, go back to practice, find that same problem, and use the help tools, because that's where you're going to be able to see a step-by-step explanation.